Here it is late August, and we're looking at the overgrowth, but is now going to seed. And I want to show you an important part of this design and why certain maintenance is required. Now, this is a very low input system, but it does require some cycling of nutrients in order to get maximum results. I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. So there are these berms here that are at the bottom of a terrace, and you can almost see them on the camera here, but there's basically a higher slope on this side than this side. When you cut the grass on these vegetative strips that are growing on top of the berm, you must remove that grass, because here's what the grass is doing. So you can see under this grass here how it is matting the underlayment, killing off the plants, and then giving us much more moisture in the soil, and actually a lot of soil biology. You can see some termites down there and other things. This grass actually needs to go down in the path that's below the berm in order to give those benefits in the appropriate location, because this berm itself needs to be firm, and this berm itself needs to have vegetation on it, because cutting this vegetation and then laying it in the garden bed gives us that weed kill that we're looking for. So a lot of folks will say, hey Justin, your grass is overgrown, the tomatoes are falling down. The reason we cycle these nutrients is for erosion control and to start feeding the soil biology. So if when you cut this grass here that's on the vegetative strip, and you can see how there's a shelf there, you have to rake it off so that you get more grass. And then this material that we're taking off with this biomass goes onto either the growing bed to mulch around your plants, or goes in upstream in your walking paths to basically keep your walking paths free. And I'm going to show you what happens. You end up with grass on the hill and clear soil on the grow beds. And worst case scenario, if done the right way, and we're going to go down to a path here that I cut out so you can see the biomass is on the pathway, but the berm rather than in the actual path. Here's where I did the same thing, except instead of putting the grass on the berm, which is part of your earthworks, the grass went in the path that's downslope. And what you'll notice is what grew back was only hairy vetch. All you've got is hairy vetch. Now, hairy vetch is a nitrogen fixing plant. I don't know if you remember, they'll probably link it below, but if you look in the description, you'll see where I mulched around these plants right here, and you can see the mulch is still there. But what grows back is only the hairy vetch. Now, why is that? We do have grass in there, but because I raked the grass off of the area which was, I raked the grass off of the earthworks berm, which is the lower part of a terrace bed, and I actually put that grass right here. You see that grass right there? I put the grass in a walking path in the lower bed, or I put the grass in the growing area upslope on the terrace. We get regrowth of the most viable and biomass ready plants. So you can see all the way down there, the regrowth is the hairy vetch. The regrowth is grasses. Now the grasses that I cut off, I actually put in this bed here, and you can see that we've got some additional growth from down here. If I push back that additional growth, you'll see a mat with nothing growing through it. This mat has killed off all of the weeds or all of the excess growth and giving me a nice moist growing bed that, again, I'm going to come back next week and flail mow some of this, but again, if I wanted to go plant in that area, it's already clear. So you can see there's overgrowth here. If I kick back the overgrowth, you'll see the path of biomass down here. Now, if you plant every other bed, you could do this where you cut the grass off of one bed and put it on the next bed. And now we're reintroducing biomass. We are growing out the seeds that are in the soil, because a lot of these seeds in the soil we don't want. We want them to grow out, cut them off before they get too big. Now, of course, we do want this kind of seed, but again, we got to get the grass out of it. We got to get the other items out of it. And by cutting the vegetative strips and putting that material downslope or upslope in a bed, the regrowth is actually beneficial, fast-growing, nitrogen-fixing plants. Again, we're growing biomass. You see when I kick back this grass from this lower area, where I had mulched, there's no plants growing. There's very little plants growing. Now, we keep going. You know, maybe you don't believe me. Under all this other stuff is viable, ready to plant grass beds. This is part, I don't know if you remember my grass-fed garden video, but you can feed your garden beds thick, long-cut grass or other biomass, and then you end up with no weeds. So it does take a little bit of work, regularly cutting the vegetative strip and then layering those materials into your walking paths, into and around your plants. But there are no weeds growing in these paths that are deeply mulched. And again, if you're in a hot climate, if you're in a dry climate, look at all the moisture that is trapped underneath here. Look at the worm activity. You see what we got going on here? Now I'm going to cover that back up. It's like a blanket on the soil. Plus, if we cut it before it goes to seed, we are now removing the seed bank from the soil, transforming it into biomass, and then feeding it back to the soil microbes to create very comfortable, low weed, basically growing areas. Now, will we eventually not have any grass grow back? Yes and no. So yes, we'll have the grass grow back on our vegetative strips, which we'll continue to cut because we haven't blanketed the soil. We haven't disturbed the root systems. So the vegetative strips, which are on earthworks or infrastructure, will continue to grow back. But where we mound the grass in our beds, in our growing spaces, we have no weeds. We have these nice grass mulched areas. Now you can add other types of mulch, you can add manures, whatever you want. But because the grass mats down, we now have a no-dig surface. Now I know you saw me in other videos do shallow tillage because we were killing off the root system. We did not do shallow tillage on the infrastructure of these terraces. We only did it in the areas where we'll be growing and where we want some seed to start to grow. We want some of this biomass, and I'm going to keep sweeping out of the way. You see that? Under all of that fell over, we've had some major storms in the area. Oh, look at this. Look at this. These are actually, this shows you how much moisture is in the soil and how much of the biomass, how much of the carbon is now readily available for fungi, for microbes, for bacterias to start to become soil. We don't need deep tillage. We don't need to disc up the field, but we do need to mind the infrastructure that is surrounding our garden areas. Now, we're doing a lot of things right, and we're doing some things wrong, but it's a learning lesson. This is a space for education. But can you see how the biomass growing on only the earthwork structure, which is the berm or the lower part of the terrace, put into the path, actually blocks the weeds, blocks the grass. This is grass that got blown over in a storm. And I'm actually, again, I'm going to mark, there's a couple persimmon trees in here. I'm going to mark those trees, but I will come through here with a flail mower and cut. I may not cut the flowers down. I'll probably start down on the bottom, but I will cut this back, and the flail mower is going to chop those materials up into small materials. They're going to give me that layer of surface coverage. And then if I do any tillage when we start to do cover crops, because a cover crop will not grow under all this mulch. You know, you won't grow cover crop in this deep mulch. But if I do a little bit of surface tillage so that we can get that soil contact, or we drill the seed in, then we will we'll have this in cover crop. Again, cover crop is a more beneficial, that's where the hairy vetch came from, is a more beneficial biomass to have available. But again, grass will work, weeds will work, wildflowers will work. For the sake of the butterflies, I don't like to disturb the wildflowers too much. You can see these beauties right here. But can you see what we're doing here? Does this make sense as far as cycling of nutrients? No more will you have to cut down the biomass and haul it out and put it in a compost pile and turn the compost pile. No more will you have to dig and trench and till. No more will you have to do these things, because we're feeding the soil, and the soil has all kinds of stuff in it to break down the nutrients that are available, to make them available for your plants. And then if done the right way, now we can do it on a bigger scale using equipment, but done the right way, even by hand, all of this turns into soil. It gets incorporated in the top layers, the top soil layer of the growing space. And then we of course start plants in the greenhouse, or we start plants or otherwise drill seed into the ground using a blade or a spike. And then ultimately we have a permaculture natural garden that regenerates itself. So that's why I'm not worried about these tall plants and things here, because sunflowers, that's great stuff, because simply we can mow an area, return that biomass, whether it's a flail mower or, and I'm not going to walk through the beds, we try not to do that, but we can return that biomass, whether we use a flail mower, whether we use a string trimmer, we can return that biomass. And I'm just going to randomly pick a spot, and I'm going to show you what's going on under the deep mulch. So this is unmulched, and this is kind of a clump of grass. You can see the tall grass. I'm going to show you what's going on under this grass. By the way, you can't, I have to flail mow this to get it down. See, just spread this out a little bit here. What's going on under here? What you can see is moisture. You can see some of this change in the soil, but all the roots are down there in the soil. And this one actually just had grass on it. All the roots are down in the soil. All the nutrients that got drawn up by the roots are above the soil, and we are matting things out. Look at that. See the clover coming through? Your clover and hairy vetch can get through this grass or this layer of mulch, but the other stuff doesn't tend to do it. Now, again, we're going to cover crop this, so I will run it over with the flail mower. I may use shallow tillage so that we can get the seed soil contact, but because a lot of this stuff went to seed, we're probably just going to flail mow it at the lowest setting to just break up that material, and only till to level the beds out. So the tillage is more to move the earth around so that it can be more level, because this is easier to flail mow when it's level. So we do have some adaptations for our equipment. But if you were doing this by hand with a scythe, if you could take that grass off, level the beds out, put that grass back on, and after you've put down a clover or some kind of nitrogen fixing cover crop, because again, notice what is coming through. The grass doesn't come through, the clover comes through. And then of course you could also take this material off, chop it, and put it back on. But again, I want to use the right appropriate equipment. I want the minimal inputs, and I want the maximum output. So the garden can get away with you. This is a perfect demonstration of some of these areas getting away from us because we've had a lot of rain. There's the interaction between the volunteers. We're also in August, which is really at the end of the season. So we're doing the last harvest now, and then Monday I'll come back and start flail mowing. But there are areas in here that the what is growing is telling me the soil information, what's going on with the soil. The primary thing that's growing is clover and hairy vetch, which is nitrogen fixing. And then ultimately, when it's flailed down, we can then start flailing it more frequently so that we don't get things back in seed. That's the biggest mistake that's happening right here, is because we've intercropped and then we've had such rapid growth. Now imagine having a garden with the biggest problem being everything grows too fast. Think about that. Think about that. As we flail mow, we can introduce seeds that we want. Now this is only the second year of this garden. We can introduce more seeds of what we want, and then we can actually flail mow more frequently to remove the things that we don't want before they go to seed. And altogether, this really becomes a rapid growing, nutrient cycling habitat. And even notice in these pathways, so this is the vehicle access point, that's not just grass. That is grass, clover, a lot of different things growing on in there. And so we have our open space, we have our growing space, and you can see the contrast. But most importantly, when the biomass is properly distributed, the only thing that's going to grow through it is clover. Unless you can see soil, then the other stuff's going to grow, because it is a mulching mat. Now, you don't have to go like this. Again, this is a large space. And again, the intersecting, flowers and stuff, we really didn't want to just flail the flowers. Plus, everything we do here is a teaching opportunity. But as you can see, even if you just come through and string trim it or scythe it, the layered materials are going to have that biological activity. You can see these little holes. These are from birds, by the way. Birds will come in here and dig around here. But it'll all have this biological activity where we're building up the topsoil. And you can see the clay under there. But on top of it is all of this topsoil that's starting to break down. And again, I'm going to go over it with the flail mower, so we'll make it even finer. And what will grow through that is some cover crop, but it's the seeds we introduced, and then we're slowly sprouting and reprocessing. You see the clover again, but we're slowly sprouting and reprocessing everything else. Now, again, we don't want these things to go to seed. And you see the wildflowers. There's a couple reasons we didn't get in here. But when you're into season, you can just flail this stuff. You can just mow it. You can use whatever you got, bush hog it, whatever. And we really didn't want this area. I know you guys are flying everywhere. We really didn't want this area to get overgrown, but again, you can see the viability, you can see the butterflies and the small birds. So we'll do more like what we've done here. We'll cut the vegetative strips, use it as mulch in the growing areas, and then we will flail anything that grows up before it goes to seed, assuming we don't have other vegetables inside there. I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. I'll see you in the next video. If you have questions about this or anything else we cover, please visit us at www.prosperityhomestead.org. Go to the contact page, ask your questions. And again, if you like and subscribe and ask your questions in the comments below, I will be more than happy to answer them. I get great joy out of answering your questions, because if you can see what we're doing here, you can do what we're doing here. It just takes application. It just takes coming out here or in your own property and putting in the expense of experience. And you can't do this wrong if you're cycling those nutrients, if you're growing, preferring your cover crops, and then again, not incorporating those cover crops to tillage, but that chop and drop layering before you go to seed.